In this show, we want to look at Reconstruction after the Civil War, and we want to look at the ways in which Reconstruction apply to our own times. In other words, what was it about Reconstruction that affects America today? As you go through this slideshow, pick out items that can be tied to the present day. That means today. These are the questions historians ask about Reconstruction. And if you look, you see that the second point relates to today. Was it an unfinished revolution? Well, if it was, then it's something we need to take a look at to complete the job. So that's what I'm talking about. Causes and consequences may have a relationship to today, but not the causes, but the consequences, or they may not, if they were short-term consequences. Now, the learning outcomes are things you need to know about Reconstruction. Some of them have a direct application to today. Can you spot which ones? Well, the first one does not. It's important, but it doesn't directly tie to today. The second one also does not, because Reconstruction historiography, well, actually, the second one does, because Reconstruction historiography continues today. And racism is not something that has disappeared. So as racism still exists, the racist interpretation of Reconstruction also exists. So you need to know what that is because it still exists today. Students will be able to identify our modern view of the successes and failures of Reconstruction. That's today. So that has application today. Students will be able to identify the Reconstruction amendments and how they were not enforced after 1877 until recently. That relates to today because we are still dealing with the failures of Reconstruction to wrap up the job of reuniting the North and South and providing rights to the newly freed slaves. Here are the goals of Reconstruction. Again, goals don't really relate to today, except insofar as they were not achieved. So be prepared to explain which of these were not achieved and how so. This explains why the goals were elusive at the time, but these do not explain why the goals of Reconstruction remain elusive. This is a description of the Dunning School, which was around about 100 years ago. It's not around anymore. But some people continue to read history books and movies and watch movies based on this racist historiography. That is, historiography is the history of historical writings, and we still see that reflected in some people's view of Reconstruction even today. So that's why we look at this, because when people look at old movies about Reconstruction, especially movies like Gone with the Wind and Birth of a Nation, they are absorbing this racist interpretation that blames blacks for the failures of Reconstruction. So we need to understand that because there are people walking around today who still believe this point of view. Now, these last slides show the examples of the failure of Reconstruction. And the failure was in large measure coming out of the South. The South refused to admit that it had lost the war. And if you look in your textbook, you will see that the South refused to go along with even moderate degrees of Reconstruction on behalf of African Americans. The black codes were the state laws that they passed, which are outrageous examples of this intransigence. But there are others that you see on this slide. But I don't think you see things that relate to today, except insofar as these failures created a failure to change the South, which we still live with today. So this slide looks at Johnson's failures, the president, his opposition to the 14th Amendment, and the South's opposition to change, which is replicated or reflected by these riots. This slide shows the charges and the answers to the charges of the Dunning School. On the left side, you see what the Dunning School, that is the tragic era interpretation, demanded or declared, and on the right side, you see why they were wrong. Radical Reconstruction is defined on this slide. How does this relate to America today? Well, these constitutional amendments are still on the books. When were they not enforced? When were they enforced? To what extent are they enforced today? That ties the Reconstruction era to today. Here are some good reforms that came out of Reconstruction. And so Reconstruction was obviously not all bad. And finally, Eric Foner says that Reconstruction was America's unfinished revolution, so it needs to be finished today. That ties to today. And here's an article on Reconstruction historiography that you may be able to apply to today.